For years, Kaliningrad has been touted as Russia's secret weapon. Tucked between Poland and Lithuania, the Russian exclave is where a war with NATO would start, many believe. And it would be a threat. Weapons are stored there. Missiles that may be capable of carrying nuclear weapons could be launched from Kaliningrad. The Kremlin wants you to believe that Russia's hold on its exclave is stronger than ever. The Kremlin is lying. Vladimir Putin's grip on Kaliningrad is slipping as the Kremlin is losing control of one of its most important territories, and we only need to look at the rhetoric coming out of Russia right now to see Putin panicking. Of course, Putin would never panic in public himself. Instead, he employs an army of lackeys and mouthpieces to hurl threats, accusations, and lies at anybody who will listen. And one of the strongest voices in that army of sycophants is the man who has been causing a lot of fuss about a supposed war between Russia and NATO, Sergei Lavrov. One of Putin's favorite mouthpieces has made it his stock in trade to claim that NATO is waging war against Russia ever since Putin launched his supposed special military operation in Ukraine. It was only a few months after that initial invasion failed and Western support started pouring into Ukraine that Lavrov started flinging his accusations around. Sky News reported on comments that Lavrov made in May 2022, where he claimed that the collective West had declared a total hybrid war against Russia through its support of Ukraine via sanctions and military aid. "We did everything to avoid a direct clash, but now that the challenge has been thrown down, we of course accept it," Lavrov claimed at the time. "We are no strangers to sanctions. They were almost always there in one form or another." The message Putin wants to get across through his mouthpiece is twofold. NATO has started a fight. Russia is ready to win that fight. Fast forward to September 2025 and the same old nonsense has been coming out of Lavrov's mouth. This time, Lavrov is claiming that everybody who supports Ukraine has declared war on Russia because the rest of Europe has the outright gall to respond as any continent should respond to Russia's constant acts of aggression. Appearing at the Group of 20 or G20 meeting of foreign ministers at the United Nations or UN in September, Lavrov repeated his claims that the West had provoked a crisis by aiding Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Worse yet, Lavrov suggested that NATO, the European Union, and even the UN itself were engaged in a direct conflict with Russia. It's a false narrative that Russia has been propagating for a while, and it all plays into something that the host of the Russian Dude YouTube channel Artem Dikarev calls a desperate need by Russia for it to constantly play the victim as it battles against NATO. And it's in this desperation that we start to see Lavrov's words are directly linked to the situation in Kaliningrad right now. At the G20, at the UN, at whatever international cocktail party he can sneak into, Lavrov repeats the same Putin conspiracy theory. The West has declared war on Russia, Dikarev says. The poor Kaliningrad exclave is surrounded by monsters and Moscow will deliver a decisive response. Russia is painted as the eternal victim, conveniently ignoring the brutality it's unleashed on Ukraine to claim every attempt Europe makes to defend itself and Ukraine against Russian aggression is somehow the start of a war. The war has long since started. Russia was the country that started it. Russia's need to paint itself as the eternal victim hides the secret that the Kremlin doesn't want anybody to discover. You can see it if you read between the lines of Lavrov's claims and his attempts to intimidate the West into not doing what it is currently doing in response to Russia's actions. Lavrov is sending a message that he doesn't intend to send, not just about the Russian Federation as a whole, but about the Kaliningrad exclave that Russia has long used to project power. Behind the smoke, the chest-pumping and the decisive response talk lies a crumbling reality, Dikarev says. The Kremlin is terrified. What Dikarev sees in Lavrov's words is the ramblings of a paranoid man who knows that the West could take Kaliningrad away from Russia at any time it sees fit. That's why Lavrov's words aren't really intended for NATO or any other perceived Russian enemy, Dikarev suggests. Lavrov, and by extension Putin, aims to use the threats Russia is levying to project power to the Russian people, rather than to the supposed enemies and attackers of the Russian state. And it's an approach that has the potential to work, at least in mainland Russia, where the vast majority of people get most of their information from official Russian news sources. Reporters Without Borders highlights the issue, noting that around 2/3 of Russians get almost all of their news from Russian television. The stations they watch are all state-owned and controlled, meaning the average Russian is fed the specific narrative that the Kremlin wants them to hear. And right now, the words coming out of Lavrov's mouth are designed to deliver the message that NATO and the European Union, or EU, are threats and Russia needs to prepare. Plenty in Russia have internet connections, of course. The country's internet connection rate is very high, Reporters Without Borders points out. But even that isn't often enough to break through the Kremlin's propaganda push. The Center for Data and Research, or CDR, highlights that fact in a March 2025 report. It says that independent media can still operate inside Russia despite state censorship. Most of that media has to rely on the internet to get that message out, and that's where the problem lies. Telegram is often the platform of choice, but 44% of Russians who responded to a CEDA survey said that they purposefully only follow pro-government channels on the social media site. By contrast, only 14% follow what CEDA calls oppositional channels, suggesting that the average Russian is not only being led down the garden path with a false narrative, but they're willing to hold the Kremlin's hand as they walk that path. Russia's problem, especially when it comes to Kaliningrad, is that a narrative that may work on what some might call the willfully ignorant Russian public is nowhere near as effective as intimidating those who really matter to Russia. The Russian elite realized it's near impossible to make smart people believe their lies, Dikharov says, so they focused on those who will. It's aimed at Russians themselves. Lavrov needs to convince the population that's starving through sanctions, losing sons on the battlefield, and seeing the economy bleed out that all of these things are necessary sacrifices because NATO is coming. Lavrov and the Kremlin need the average Russian to believe that message, and while the propaganda may work on the mainland, Kaliningrad is a different kettle of fish. Russia may find it a lot harder to convince the people living in that tiny exclave that NATO and the EU are the enemies that the Kremlin wants to position them as. And it's this very barrier to convincing Kaliningrad's people that could lead to Putin losing control over the entire exclave. We'll come back to that point later in the video. For now, let's hone in on the Kaliningrad problem that Russia has. The Kremlin sees this problem as stretching almost Europe-wide, with Russia's main bone of contention being NATO's expansion across the continent during the last few decades. Of course, Russia's claims that NATO expands to threaten Russia aren't true, as Dikharov points out. NATO didn't expand because Brussels was itching to poke the bear, he says. It expanded because every neighbor of Russia looked at Moscow's track record and said, nope, not trusting them. Russia does have a semblance of a point in that NATO is indeed expanding. The ND International Security Center highlights this in its tracking of the addition of NATO members over time. When Putin came to power, NATO only had 19 members. Since 2000, it has added around a dozen more. Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia are among those new members. However, the ones that really sting Russia are the states that are both close to the Russian mainland and could present a threat to Kaliningrad. The three Baltic states of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania all joined NATO in 2004. Finland and Sweden, which had long held themselves to be somewhat neutral countries, joined in 2023 and 24 respectively, both as responses to the Russian aggression seen in Ukraine. So yes, there has been NATO expansion. What Lavrov wants to hide is that Russia brought all of this on itself with its actions in Europe over the last few decades, the invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, and most recently the invasion of Ukraine. Those are the reasons why NATO has grown and may continue to grow in the future, to the point where it represents a major threat to Russia and Kaliningrad. Russia's actions could be the cause of Kaliningrad's demise, and Putin knows it. That's why he's sending Lavrov out to refute every claim that NATO and the EU make about Russia committing acts of aggression against those two organizations. And in typical Lavrov fashion, every rebuke is also accompanied by a threat. The Putin mouthpiece is now claiming that the EU in particular is openly planning to launch an attack on Kaliningrad, which is another action that will be met with Russia's so-called decisive responses. The militarization of the island of Bornholm has come under fire by Lavrov, as he claims that it's all part of the EU and NATO strategy to assert more control over the Baltic region. Bear in mind that practically every state in the Baltic is part of NATO, with Kaliningrad being the only scrap of territory that Russia controls in the region. Again, it's all messaging that ignores the fact that such build-ups, along with the NATO expansion itself, are only happening because of the scale of the threat that Russia and Kaliningrad pose to the rest of Europe. This isn't the EU or NATO getting ready to invade. It's these organizations preparing to rip Kaliningrad out of Russia's control if Putin ever gets brave enough to fully declare the Europe-wide war that Russia's actions suggest that he wants. NATO and the EU aren't being aggressive, they're being smart. Kaliningrad, thanks to Russia's actions, is now in a very vulnerable position. Kaliningrad is surrounded, Dikharov says. It's isolated, and in modern warfare, its military bases could be flattened before Moscow even knows what happened. So there is a grain of truth to the Kremlin propaganda in the sense that NATO and the EU represent a very clear threat to Kaliningrad. It's just not the type of threat Lavrov wants people to believe it is. There will be no invasion of the Russian exclave unless Russia gives NATO a reason to launch that invasion. For now, NATO and the EU seem happy to let Russia stew in the mess that it's made, all while taking actions around Kaliningrad that terrify the Kremlin and further isolate Russia from its exclave. We've already touched on the militarization of islands. There's also the buildup of stronger border defenses in Poland and the Baltic states to consider. Plus, Russia may soon face a future where it struggles to even power Kaliningrad. As Euractiv reports, the Baltic region is in the process of divorcing itself from the Russian power grid, While that will hurt Russia in the sense that less energy revenue enters Putin's war chest, it also causes problems for Kaliningrad. The exclave relies on the Baltic portion of the Russian grid to get its power. When the Baltic nations switch off from Russia's power grid, they'll take Kaliningrad with it. The Baltic states have alternatives. Kaliningrad doesn't. Every word out of Lavrov's mouth screams vulnerability rather than power projection. At this point, everything Russia is saying about the NATO threat to Kaliningrad is less about a potential invasion, as Lavrov constantly claims, and more about the shot to Russia's pride that Putin's eroding grip on the exclave has caused. That's why NATO threats sting so much, because they cut into Russia's fragile pride, Dikarev notes. It's not just about strategy, it's about humiliation. If Kaliningrad is vulnerable, Russia itself, and more importantly Putin, look vulnerable. That's the key. NATO's rhetoric is Putin's greatest fear. Take the comments made by US Army Europe and Africa Commander Chris Donahue back in July as an example. As tensions continue to ramp up between NATO and Russia, Donahue said that NATO has the ability to capture Kaliningrad in a time frame that is unheard of, if it needed to do so. Those words would have stung the Kremlin so much because they're not like Russia's attempts to threaten and intimidate. Putin knows that his threats carry very little weight outside of Russia itself. He also knows that when a prominent NATO commander says that NATO could take Kaliningrad without trying, it's not just an empty threat, it's a statement of fact that reveals just how tenuous Russia's hold is on the exclave. It's all paranoia seeping out of Putin. And there's no greater monument to the Kremlin's fear that it could lose Kaliningrad than a giant radar installation that Russia is currently building in the exclave. News first broke of this installation in mid-August, when reports started emerging about satellite images suggesting the construction of a massive circular disposed antenna array. Located just 25 kilometers from Kaliningrad's border with Poland, that radar array was supposed to communicate the message that Russia has eyes on NATO. We covered the array in plenty of depth in an August video, so check it out if you want to learn more about how Russia intends to use the new structure. The array is yet another attempt by Russia to project strength via Kaliningrad. All it really achieves is further highlighting of Russia's insecurity. To the Russian media, it's proof of strength, Dikarev proclaims. To Lavrov, it's a warning. We can see everything, we can neutralize all threats. But to NATO, it's a flashing neon sign of insecurity. And NATO's reaction to the radar array was the exact opposite of what Russia expected. The enemy was supposed to panic. It was supposed to beg Russia not to build this array. Instead, NATO is letting Russia throw millions, perhaps even billions of dollars at a boondoggle that seems more in keeping with the Soviet era. Poland and the Baltic states, with the help of NATO, will keep bolstering their defenses. Russia's giant eye on the Baltic would face the same fate as the rest of Kaliningrad if a war broke out, so it's not threatening to NATO. Weakness is all that Russia has managed to project via Kaliningrad ever since Putin invaded Ukraine. A radar array, no matter how massive it may be, isn't going to stop NATO's modern weapons from devastating Kaliningrad should the time come for them to do so. Putin himself has claimed on so many occasions that he isn't interested in engaging the West in an arms race. He was saying as much in 2018 following another landslide presidential win, and he's been saying it throughout the Ukraine war. Building a massive radar array would seem to run counter to that claim, Dikarev points out. It does, but the likely uselessness of that array as a tool to defend Kaliningrad suggests that Putin doesn't see it as a weapon. He sees it as a symbol, a way to show NATO and the people living in Kaliningrad that Russia is still a player on the global stage, Dikarev says. And that brings us back to a point we raised earlier in the video about how it may end up being the people living in Kaliningrad who ultimately determine the exclave's fate. The real dirty little secret that hides behind Lavrov's threats and Russia's NATO fears isn't necessarily militaristic. Russia's insecurity over Kaliningrad rests in the fact that some of the exclave's people don't see themselves as Russian citizens, at least not in the same sense as those living in the motherland. How could they? Kaliningrad is isolated. Russia uses it as a pawn in the games it plays against Europe, often paying little attention to what the territory's people actually want. Russia's propaganda tends to hide the fact that people living in Kaliningrad are far more connected to their European neighbors than anybody in Russia itself. Kaliningrad isn't Moscow, Dikarev says. It isn't Siberia, it's a region that breathes Europe. Its people cross into Poland and Lithuania for shopping, study and work, at least the ones who still can. Kaliningrad has more in common with its European neighbors than the country trying to maintain its grip on the exclave. And for many in the exclave, integration into Europe is a far more desirable option than continued use by Russia as a means to project power. It's difficult to prove that fact. Russia's suppression of information out of the exclave ensures that. However, one unofficial referendum conducted in 2023 shows that Kaliningrad likely has a silent or perhaps silenced majority that would love nothing more than for Russia to lose its grip. The The Human Security Center reported on this referendum in July 2023, noting that it was unofficial and carried out online because such votes are deemed illegal by Russia. Residents were asked the simple question of whether they wanted to remain under Russian control or see Kaliningrad achieve independence. No territory that Russia controls can vote on whether it wants Russia to maintain that control, but the referendum happened anyway. The Human Security Center says that 95,567 people in Kaliningrad took part in that referendum, which is about a fifth of the exclave's population. That's large enough to be considered a suitable sample size, and the outcome of the referendum sent a clear message to Putin. Kaliningrad wants out of the Russian Federation. After 13 days of the online vote being open, 72.1% of the exclave's population that took part said they would rather that Kaliningrad be independent than remain under Russian control. That's a big part of the population that outright rejects Russia's hold over their lives. It's no wonder that the Kremlin is so insecure about Kaliningrad's future. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has only fed the discontent that has been looming in Kaliningrad for years. People from the exclave, who refer to themselves as Baltic Russians, held a protest in front of the Russian embassy in Poland when Putin invaded Ukraine. The fact that this protest happened on the territory of a NATO member sends almost as strong a message about the desire for independence from Russia inside Kaliningrad as the protest itself. More tensions are coming to the surface thanks to the impact that Putin's invasion has had on Kaliningrad's people. Life in Kaliningrad has gotten worse, Dikharov says. Sanctions choke trade, tourism collapsed, prices rise while wages stagnate, and every time Lavrov rants about defending Kaliningrad, locals roll their eyes because they know they're the ones paying the price. We come back to the Kremlin propaganda. On the surface, it's all part of what Russia usually does. NATO is attacking, Kaliningrad will be defended. However, the reality is that Russia's insecurity is showing. Putin knows that NATO could topple Kaliningrad anytime it wants to do so. But NATO may not have to. Rather than forcing Russia to relinquish the exclave, NATO may just need to wait for Kaliningrad's people to extract themselves from Putin's once vice-like grip. That grip has loosened plenty since the war began. The ranting and raving of people like Lavrov show that Russia knows it's on the verge of losing control. Speaking of propaganda and Russia's attempts to spread false messages about its strength, Ukraine has just caught Russia lying again. Russia tried to say that it had taken control of the village of Verbova, only for Ukraine to prove that Russian infiltrators had been taken out minutes after they entered the settlement. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show if you want more coverage of the latest goings-on in Kaliningrad. And thank you for watching.